on this webinar. We did it a couple of months ago. Some of you may have been with us for that. It was actually a very popular topic. This is the second time, as I mentioned, that we've ever done this topic. So we hope that, looks like we have a pretty good crowd here today, and we hope that you all get a lot out of it. And as I mentioned, send over any questions you have to the chat. I will get going here with a little bit of an introduction. My name is Phil Bowers. I'm the Senior Marketing Manager here at Grandstream, joined by Abdel, who will take you through the actual training part of today's webinar. He is one of our support gurus, so you'll be in very good hands. So before we do get going, I always like to mention that this webinar is being brought to you by IP Video Talk. I'm sure many of you are familiar with IP Video Talk by now. IP Video Talk is a service that we here at Grandstream developed entirely in-house and launched last year. It was originally launched as a plug-and-play cloud video conferencing platform for our GVC series of video conferencing hardware devices, but we have really grown it into a full web conferencing platform. It gives you the ability to do hardware-based video conferencing, web video conferencing, and hold webinars like you see here today. So everything you're seeing here today, the whole platform, all the features, the functionality of the platform that is bringing this webinar to you, which is IP Video Talk. Getting pretty much a free demonstration of it here today. And you can go online and get a free trial at any point in time, ipvideotalk.com. You can actually, at the moment, get a free trial of a web meeting platform that gives you the ability to hold free web-based video conferences, whether it be from computers, laptops, mobile devices, tablets with the IP Video Talk app. So check that out, ipvideotalk.com. Here's just a general agenda. We used this last time, might be a little bit different this time, as I mentioned, pretty methodical fashion, but just kind of wanted to give you an idea of a lot of the things that we are going to be covering here today. Not potentially exactly in this order, but these are the general things that we plan to cover here today. So as I mentioned, before we go into the training, just want to give a quick introduction into our Gateways and ATAs series, just for those of you that might not be familiar with it. We're going to start with our ATAs, and before I go into it, Grandstream, and I'm sure many of you know this, Grandstream is one of the leading providers of we have somebody saying that there's a blank screen right now. If anyone could let me know through the chat if you're also seeing a blank screen, that would be great. If that is the case, there is, you shouldn't be seeing a blank screen. You should be seeing some slides up on the screen at the moment. But if you are, okay, cool. Just wanted to make sure. If you are having issues with, you're not seeing anything on your screen, maybe check your local network connection to see if that might be the issue. Cool. All right, so to get back into what I was talking to, our ATAs, Grandstream's been making ATAs basically since it was one of the very first products we made back in 2002. We've been making ATAs for 15 years, and we are pretty much the leading manufacturer and the biggest producer of analog telephone adapters in the world today. We have deals with some of the largest service providers across the world. In most regions of the world. We produce millions of these devices a year. And as I mentioned, we work with some great and very large service providers who have very strict requirements and do very stringent testing on these devices before we work with them. So these devices, all of our ATAs, all of our gateways are not just very thoroughly tested here, but they are often tested by some of the largest service providers in the world before we even release the product. So let's start with our HT800 series. These are our new series of of analog telephone adapters. We have the HT801, which gives you 2 FXS ports, 2 SIP accounts, the HT812, which gives you 2 FXS ports, 2 gigabit ports, 2 SIP accounts, the HT814, 4 FXS ports, 2 gigabit ports, 4 SIP accounts. There's also now an HT802, I believe, in there as well. Is there? Am I making that up? All right, that's what I thought. This was, again, an older slide. Actually, you see the HT802 on the next screen. So this is basically just an updated series of ATAs. Previously, we had the HT700 series, and before that, we have the HT, 500 series, all of those devices are still in production and still being manufactured and sold by a lot of our partners. These HT800 series is just kind of the refreshed and the updated look and feel. As you can see, they look a little bit different, a little bit more sleek, which that requirement, again, came from a lot of our service provider customers. We're deploying these to end users. Many of them are not super tech savvy, and the color-coded ports and the sleek device just make it very easy to interact with, very easy to install. All of these devices feature auto provisioning. And if you're looking for an NAT router, which we feature on some of our other ATAs as well, the HT812 and the H14 have that. Again, that is a wired router. It's not a wireless router. Gives you the ability to bring in an internet signal or internet connection into the ATA and then extend it out to computers or wireless routers that you may be using with it. So as I mentioned, the real highlight of the new HT100 series are the new look and feel, the new kind of sleek look to them, which kind of looks like a lot of the other devices we have. Our decked phone repeater is going to look like this. It's kind of this kind of sleek, black, shiny faceplate, or excuse me, plastic look is kind of where we're going in terms of the design of our product. Again, the color-coded ports just to make it easy to install, and then you have the LED backlit indicators for each of the devices on the front of it. So that's the HT800 series, the new, we'll say, most modern-looking ATA that we have. Great for anyone not super tech savvy because of how easy it is to install. The other devices that we have, and again, as I mentioned, still available through distribution. Many of these we're still manufacturing as well. The HT700 series. Frankly, the HT700 series and the 800 series are very much similar. The HT800 series, I believe, the only real differences are we say that it can support HD audio. The question always that I get there, comes into, how can an analog phone support HD audio? Basically, our ATA is able to optimize it to increase the quality of the strength of the clarity of the signal, though the phone might not be able to actually support the G722 wideband codec, and we also will support gigabit speeds on the HT800 series. So the 700 series, we have the 701, one FXS port, 702 and 704, which either give you 2 or 4 FXS ports. The 701 will give you 1 SIP profile. The 02 and the 04 will give you 2 SIP accounts, auto provisioning with these devices, which you're going to see across all of our gateways and ATAs. The HT500 series, which is currently the oldest or longest running, is what I should say, series of ATAs that we make. The HT502 gives you 2 FXS ports, and the HT503, a little bit of a hybrid ATA, gives you 1 FXS, 1 FXO port. And all of the HT500 series gives you the integrated NAT routers. The 700 series does not, and then the 800 series does give you the built-in NAT router functionality. So just to kind of wrap up the ATAs discussion here, I mentioned most of this earlier, some of the reasons why our ATAs are so great. I mentioned the proven track record. We're one of the largest manufacturers of ATAs in the world. We work with and sell these devices to some of the largest service providers in the world. They're stringently tested. As you see, we have a whole portfolio of them. And one of the few companies, frankly, anymore that actually offers for full portfolio of ATAs, and that's because we're so good at making them, and we have and as you see, they're used quite often in the millions across the world. Support a lot of different provisioning options, XML, TRO69. We offer our GAP service, which we could probably have a whole separate webinar to go through. It's a little bit of an automated provisioning server that we offer. Check in with your Grandstream distributor for more information on GAPs. UCM0 config, a number of other ways that these devices can be provisioned, basically show you that you can provision them a lot of different ways. And I think one of the most overlooked features of Grandstream products, and specifically these gateways and ATAs here, something that we even forget about, I think, here is the secondary SIP server or the failover SIP server, or whatever you want to call it. All of our devices, including these gateways and ATAs, you can build in a secondary SIP server, so if the main SIP server or the main service goes down, the IP phones, the whole network, the devices will automatically switch to that secondary SIP server, guarantees no service outings, Great for service providers, another popular feature with them. Couple other things here to wrap up on the ATAs. Wide codec support, including G729, does give you full support for T38 fax. Gives you a suite of telephony features, VoIP features that are able to be extended to these analog phones. Supports pretty much all of the major caller ID formats. Lots of different formats used across the world, and again, these devices are rolled out across the world so they can support pretty much every major one, as well as all of the major disconnect methods as well. All right, so now we're going to move over to our gateways, and I should be able to get through this here in the next couple of minutes so we can get into the technical training part of today. We pretty much have three major series of gateways out there. Our largest and most popular series and newest series is what you see here on the screen, our GXW 4200 series. These are high-density gigabit models with either 16, 24, 32, or 48 ports. Just like all the other devices, multiple SIP provisioning, or profiles, excuse me. Lots of different auto provisioning methods. I mentioned that they give you gigabit network ports, and these devices are great for server rooms or whatnot because they are rack mountable. And again, these are gigabit FXS gateways, great for integrating large amounts of analog devices with a VoIP network. The other gateway series that we have, which are still available through distribution, a 4 and 8 port FXS gateway on the left, our GXW 4004 and 4008, and then on the right, our 4104 and 4108. Those are FXO gateways. See on the left the 4000 series, the FXS gateways, 4 or 8 ports, integrated NAT router, just like you saw on some of our ATAs. PSTN failover lifeline support, and again, just like the ATA's ability to extend a lot of those great VoIP features to analog phones, the FXO gateway, again, 4 or 8 FXO ports, multiple SIP profiles, auto provisioning, just like all of our other gateways and ATAs. And to wrap up the gateway discussion, a lot of the same things you're going to see here that we also talked about with the ATAs. Wide codec support, including G729, including G729, that's the highlight there. Fax support, full support of T38 fax, the extension of VoIP features to these analog devices, the support for all the major caller ID formats and all the major disconnect methods. And again, just like our ATAs, a wide range of provisioning options to make these devices very quick and easy to set up for anybody, as well as that secondary, the ability to use that secondary SIP server or failover SIP server to guarantee no service outage. All right, so that wraps up my little introduction here. Bear with us for just a moment. We're going to transfer control of the presentation over to Abdel, who will take you through the actual technical training part of today's webinar. So just bear with us here for a second. All right, thank you. No problem.
Well, thank you, Phil, for the presentation. And again, thanks everyone for joining the webinar today. For the second part of this webinar, I'm going to show you the web interface of the GXW 4004 that we're going to use for this webinar. I'm going to try to go through most of the settings available on the gateway and what purposes they serve. For the GXW 4004, there are multiple ways how you can get to the web access. You can use the LAN port, and by default, if you use the LAN port, you need to type in the IP address 192.168.2.1. The LAN port of the gateway has a DHCP service enabled by default, so when you connect to the LAN port, it's going to provide an IP address for your PC. The other option, you can also connect the LAN port, then you can connect an analog phone to one of the FXS ports. Then you can use one of those voice menu options that allows you to get the IP address. for example, the option to get the IP address of the gateway is triple star then 002. If you go to the user guide of the GXW, it gives you a list of all the voice prompts that are supported on the GXW. For our case, for example, if we dial three times, and then we use 02, it's going to provide us the IP address. You can also use the other options like 01 to toggle between DHCP and static and PoE mode. You can also use those voice prompts to configure the gateway from the analog phone. So the IP of my phone is this one, so I'm just going to go ahead and log in. By default is admin, the password. When you log in for the first time, it's going to give you, of course, the status page, which gives you information about the device that you're using. For example, the MAC address. Since it's using two Ethernet ports, it's going to give you the MAC address of the WAN port, and the second one is the MAC address of the LAN port. For the device configuration, when you would like to provision the GXW, the config file, of course, needs to include the MAC address. Always make sure you include the LAN MAC address in the config file. That's why you have that information here that says device MAC. Then it gives you the WAN IP address, what model you're using, and the firmware version that is running on the gateway. If you ever ask about the firmware version, always look for the program version. That's the one that represents the firmware version of your gateway. And then it gives you the status. You can see the status of the ports, whether they are registered or not registered. If you see right here, I have the FXS port 1 registered. And then it gives you the static on hook or off hook. If you move, for example, and then you call a different number, you're going to see that the status of the port will change. For example, I'm calling right now, the status is going to change from on hook to ring back because I'm calling a different extension. The port options, if you have DND enabled or call forwarding enabled, you're just going to see it's right here with the information. For example, if you have FXS1 configured with port forwarding, let's say to extension 1000, it's going to show you port forwarded enable, and then it's going to show you to which extension the calls have been forwarded. The next tab is the basic settings. This is where you can change the end user password. There are two passwords that you can use to log into to the GXW. You can use the end user password, or you can use the admin password that you can change under advanced settings. And one thing about the end user password, when you log in with the end user password, you will only have access to the status and the basic settings. So you're not going to be able to have access to the other tabs to make changes to the gateway. By default, the HTTP access of the gateway is using port 80. If you want to change it, you can just go ahead and put any port that you would like to assign it. Just make sure it's not conflicting with another port that is being used by another device. There's also the option where you can configure the telnet. You can enable it or disable it. By default, it's enabled. Like on the latest ATAs, like HT 814 and 12, we also included the SSH option, which provides more security than the telnet connection. By default, the WAN port is using a DHCP. If you would like to assign it a static IP address, just check status and then include your information like the IP address, the subnet mask, the default router, and of course make sure you include the DHCP server, especially if you are using a domain name for the SIP server. Then you can configure also the time zone, or you can specify the self-defined time zone by using those patterns right here. This is specifically for daylight time saving, where you can tell it, for example, when it starts and when it ends. For example, the example that we have right here, that means it's month 3, which is March, the 2nd week, and then 0 means the first day, which is Sunday. If you go to the user guide of GXW, it's going to explain you and gives you example about how to configure it. Then next we have the configuration of the port. As I said, the GXW comes with 2 Ethernet ports, so you can use the GXW to work as a router, or you can use it to work as a switch. If you would like to use it as a router, leave it as the default one. Then it has a DHCP service enabled, and it's going to assign you IP addresses. If you would like the devices, when they connect through the LAN port, to get access from your local area network and not from the gateway, just make sure you choose the bridge. This way, the 2 ports in the back of the GXW, they're just going to work in the switch mode. And then you have some settings about the NAT, TCP timeout, and NAT UDP timeout. You can also specify the uplink bandwidth, the downlink bandwidth. You can enable or disable UPnP. You can also enable responding to ping messages if you want to add more security to your gateway. By default, it's enabled. If you would like to disable replying to ping messages, just check yes. If you would like to disable HTTP access and telnet access to the gateway, you can just select no. And then at the bottom here, which provides more security, you can tell actually the gateway, you can enable there, for example, the WAN access, and then you can tell the gateway what are the IP addresses that are allowed to access the gateway. You can also include the blacklist if you notice that someone is trying to log in, someone that is unauthorized and it's trying to log into the web interface of the gateway. You can actually include their IP addresses in this box. You can include multiple ones, just make space between them, and then include, for example, a different IP. So when you enable blacklist, that means anybody else can log into the web interface of the gateway except these IPs. But if you use the whitelist, for example, let's say I have this IP, that means nobody else will be able to log into the web interface of the gateway except this IP address. This is a nice feature also. You can change the MAC address of the gateway. You can clone it. You can assign it any MAC address in a hexadecimal format. You can also enable or disable DHCP just by checking yes or no. And then you can choose which subnet you would like to assign from the LAN port. So by default, this is the subnet network that it's going to be using. If you would like to assign it 1010, then just include it this way and then include the last octet. So this one, it's going to assign IPs from 10.10.10.100 up to 199 using the subnet mask 255.255.255. There's also the option where you can configure the WAN port, especially if you would like to access devices that are connected to the LAN side of the gateway and you would like to access them from the WAN side. You can just simply put, let's say I have my laptop, I can just choose a random port. Let's say the IP address of my laptop is 10.10.102, and I would like to access, for example, SSH. I'm just going to choose it this way. So when I try to log in to the device on the LAN port, I'm just going to use the WAN IP address of the gateway, colon, plus this port, then it's going to take me to this IP address behind the LAN on this port. The next tab is the advanced settings, and I mentioned you can change the default admin password. You also have the option where you can configure the VLAN tagging. By default is 0, that means it's not tagged. If, for example, you have this gateway on VLAN 20 and you would like it to send traffic with VLAN 20 tag, you just include 20. You can also specify the 802.1p class. Let's say using 5, just include 5 in there and save and apply. These changes, usually changes that are related to network settings, they usually require rebooting the gateway to take effect. Then next we have the stun server. The stun server allows SIP endpoints to find out their public IP address and the type of NAT they are behind and the internet side port associated by the NAT with particular local port. This is useful if you have it behind a firewall or router. You can just include, if you browse on the internet, you're going to find a lot of stun servers that you can use them for free. Then you can specify the interval. Then next you have the firmware upgrade and provisioning. You have 3 options. You can use a TFTP, HTTP, or HTTPS. Just include the IP address. Let's say, for example, you have a local TFTP server and you would like to upgrade the gateway. You can just enter the IP address of the TFTP server. If you have your own provisioning server, you can also include the IP address of the config server. The XML config file server, you can also, so when you create the config file of the GXW, it's in XML format, so you can provision it to the gateway. If you would like to give it more security by encrypting the config file, you can do that by using OpenSSL to encrypt the file. It's just one line command that you can run it on a Linux machine. Then it's going to generate an encrypted file of the GXW. So the password or the key or the secret key that you're going to use to encrypt the config file, that's the one that you're just going to enter in this box so that the gateway will be able to decrypt the file. If you are using authentication for HTTP and HTTPS, just include the username and password. And next you have option allow DHCP option 66. That's in case your DHCP server is configured with these options. Basically these options, what they do, let's say you have that one set to yes, and by default all Grandstream devices, they come, for example, with this link. So instead of you, for example, going to each gateway and changing them, you can actually push your own config server path or your firmware server path through option 66. So when the gateway receives option 66, it's going to override whatever it has in the config server path. 3CX provision, this one is enabled when the gateway reboots. They usually send a subscribe message that includes their own MAC address. This is useful if you are using it, for example, with the Grandstream UCM. When the UCM, for example, detects that there is a Grandstream device that is looking for provisioning, it's gonna look at the subscribe message and check in the config, like the 0 config, and see if it has a config file for that device. If it has a config file for that device, it's just gonna push it to this device. This is where you, in case you would like to use secure SIP, this is where you upload the SIP TLS certificate and the SIP TLS private key. And next you have those settings for the ACS or the auto configuration system, which is a provisioning service that handles the communication with the endpoint devices or CPE. And this is achieved through the use of the TR69 standard. So just get the information from your ACS and just include them in these boxes. As I mentioned at the beginning of my presentation, I talked about configuring the gateway using the voice prompt. If you would like to disable those options, just check yes, or you can simply lock the keypad updates, which means no configuration update will be used or configured through the keypad. You also have the option direct IP calls. Sometimes you can use the gateway to call other devices without having to be registered to an IP PBX. If that is the case, you can use direct IP call to call those devices without the need to have an IP PBX. If you have an IP PBX and you don't need direct IP call, you can actually disable that option so that no one can use direct IP calls. As Phil mentioned earlier, the gateway, they have the lifeline mode. I'm just going to show you something right here. In the back of the gateway, it has an FXO port or a line port. That means if there is no power and this device has no power, then you have an analog phone connected to the FXS port 1, and then you have a PSTN line connected to the FXO port. You're going to have a lifeline option, which means the analog phone that is connected to the FXS port 1 will still be able to make outbound calls through the PSTN line even if there is no power. This is very useful, especially in cases of emergency where you still want to give the users the option to call, for example, 911. You have three options. You can set it to auto. That means the gateway is going to use the SIP account, but if there is no power, that's when it's going to switch to the PSTN line. Or you can simply disconnect the line and never be in use, or you can always connect it. That means FXS1 will always use the PSTN line. Another option for redundancy is you can use it to fail over to an FXO gateway. You can use, for example, our gateway GXW 4000 with the GXW 4100 to implement, for example, a similar scenario to this. Let's say you have a GXW 4000 connected to the SIP server through the internet. If something goes wrong with your SIP server, you still want to have a failover so that the calls can go through the GXW 4100. You can implement scenarios similar to this one. So what happens when the gateway talks to the SIP server and there is no response, it's just going to fail over to the GXW 4100, which is an FXO gateway, so that you can still make calls from the PSTN lines. But saying that, that means you still have to configure to do some kind of configuration on the FXO gateway to create the peer-to-peer connection. Then we have the NTP server. You can just leave it by default, or you can change it. A bunch of them on the internet that you can choose one of them and just put it in there. The syslog server, this is very useful in case we are doing some troubleshooting. You don't need to have a syslog server. If you have one, that's good. If not, you can install, for example, Wireshark on your computer, and then you can just point the syslog server to the IP address of your computer on which Wireshark is running. So when you do that, make sure you save and apply, then reboot the gateway, because syslog takes effect only after reboot. And always make sure you choose the debug and send SIP log, because we would like to capture the SIP messages also. So check that one to yes. Next we have Radius. As you know, GXW 4000 supports Radius for authentication, authorization, and billing purposes. You have the option to configure the primary and secondary Radius service to provide redundancy to this feature. So you just get the IP address, configure the ports, and you should be all set. I mean, if you look at those settings, there isn't much you can configure. It's only the information that you need to get from your Radius server. You also have the option to configure, this is a sort of backup. So when you configure a gateway and you would like to keep a copy of this configuration, you have two options. You can use a TXT file or you can use an XML file. By default, the gateways, when they get provisioned, we most of the time use XML configuration, because we also support the binary configuration file. You can also do manual upload of firmware, or just do manual upload of the backup to restore it or you can take a backup from one system and then just put it on a different system. Next is the Profile tab. The Profile tab, this is where you do most of your SIP settings. If you would like to use Profile 1, of course, make sure it's active, set to yes, then include the IP address of your SIP server. If you are using failover, like for redundancy, you can include the second IP address of the second server. Let's say I have two of them. If the primary one goes down, the gateway will start talking to the second one. Then you have the next option, prefer primary SIP server, set to yes or no. If you set it to yes, that means if the primary one goes down, the gateway is going to register to the second one. But when the registration expires, the gateway will always try to talk to the primary one. If you just want it, for example, when it switches to the second failover SIP server, just set it to no. This way, the gateway will remain connected or registered to the failover SIP server until you fix the primary SIP server. Then you can just go back to the gateway and then just do some kind of reboot. Then you have the outbound proxy. That depends whether your carrier supports it or no. Then next we have the SIP transport. We support 3, UDP, which is the widely used, or you can use TCP or TLS for encryption. Then you have NAT traversal. You have the option to set it to no if all devices are behind the NAT. If you have the gateway, for example, behind NAT or firewall or router, and that is connected to an IP PBX that is on the public network, I always recommend people to set that one to keep alive. When you set it to keep alive, basically what the gateway does, it's going to send some empty UDP packets to your router just to keep the connection open. This way your router will remember where the gateway is located together with the ports, or what we call the sockets. The DNS modes that we support here, we have the A record, SRV record, NAPTR, SRV, or you can use the configured IP. Usually, most carriers, they use NA record. Some of them, this is useful. I mean, you can touch those settings in case you have a domain name. If you have an IP address, you don't have to worry about changing the DNS mode. Some carriers, for example, when they provide you with domain name, they might have 3 or 4 IP addresses associated with the same domain name. If that is the case, then go ahead and make sure you check the SRV, so that when the gateway resolves the domain name, it's going to resolve it with the 4 available IP addresses for the same gateway. Next, most of the settings at the bottom, they're related to SIP message. The first one is use request routing ID in SIP invite header. This is in case you would like to push your caller ID in the first invite. This one is related to another setting under the FXS port, which is right there. So in case, for example, extension 1016, when it makes outbound calls, you want it to use this caller ID, just configure the request URI routing ID with the caller ID that you would like to send, and then come back here and check that one to yes. So every time the FXS1 with extension 1016, it makes an outbound call, it's going to use the caller ID that we configured under the request routing ID. SIP registration, you set it to yes. In case you are using this gateway for the example that we talked about right here. In this example, let's say we don't have a SIP server and we just would like to, let's say, extend those PSTN lines over an IP network. You can use it with that scenario, but in that case, you need to disable SIP registration. This is useful, especially when there's like one business in 2 buildings, and instead of running like PSCL lines between the two buildings, they can take advantage of the established network, and then they can connect the two buildings, like extend the PSCL lines from building A to building B over an IP network. And register on reboots. That means if the gateway, before it's going to start rebooting, it's going to unregister to cancel the registration or to remove the registration. You can also set that one to yes when you have a peer-to-peer connection. This option, outgoing call without registration, you should have that one set to yes for that scenario. And then you have certain timeouts that you can configure, like registration expiration by default is 60 minutes. That means when the gateway registers with the SIP server, after 60 minutes, it's going to start re-registering again. You can tell the gateway, for example, the registration expires after 60 minutes, but I want you, for example, to renew the registration every 15 minutes. Then you can, or 12 minutes or 20 minutes, you can tell it, for example, after 20 minutes, I want you to renew the registration. The next timeout is the SIP registration failure retry time. That means when the gateway tries to register and there's no response from the gateway, it's going to keep trying every 20 seconds to register. The next one, this is different from the previous one. The previous one, this one that we just talked about, that means if it tries to register and there's no response, it's going to try again after 20 seconds. The next one, which is 1200 seconds or 20 minutes, that means when the gateway tries to register and it gets rejected with the SIP event 403 or 603, the gateway will try to re-register again after 20 minutes. And then the next we have the layer 3 QoS or the DSCP. For expedited forwarding, we use the value 26 so that you can prioritize voice traffic over data traffic or streaming. This is for SIP. For RTP, you can use 46. The local SIP port that we're using is 5060, so in case you would like to change this port, you can just include or choose any port that is not being used in your network. It could be any port, it doesn't matter. By default, the gateway is using RTP port 5004. You can also change that one, or you can use that option at the bottom that says use random port. When you check that one to yes, that means the gateway is not going to be using those configured ports. It's just going to be generating random ports for itself. Next, we have that option that says transfer on conference hangup. By default, it's disabled. And this one is useful when, for example, A calls B, then they call C, and all of them, they merge in a conference call. If the person that initiates the conference call, let's say A, hangs up the phone, the whole conference call is going to hang up. If you would like, for example, A to initiate a conference call with B and C, but if A hangs up the call, you still want B to talk to C, set that one to yes. So even if the person that initiates the conference call hangs up, the call will still continue. Next, we have the same thing about the conference, the three-way conference. The way we initiate the three conference on the gateway is by using a feature code *23. Those features are also, you can find them under the user manual of the GXW. There are a lot of those features that you can probably take advantage of. For example, you can enable SRTP or disable it. You can enable DND. You can enable or disable call waiting. You can configure unconditional call forwarding or disable conditional call forwarding. You can also, when you want to initiate a blind transfer, you use *87. So you have a lot of feature codes that you can find them under the user manual the ATAs or the gateway. Remove outbound proxy. By default, if you have an outbound proxy configured, the gateway is going to include its IP address in the route header in the SIP message. If you want to remove the route header, just set that one to yes. Then next here we have some security features. These options right here. Validate incoming SIP message. That means if there is a SIP message that comes to the gateway, the gateway is going to match it against the RFC rules. If the message does not match, it's just going to reject the whole SIP message. This one right here, check SIP user ID for incoming invite. This is very useful in case you are receiving ghost or phantom calls on your analog device. Make sure you set that one to yes. There are actually two options. There is this option right here, and there is another option that you can tell, for example, the gateway allow incoming SIP messages from SIP proxy only. That means only calls coming from your SIP provider or your IP PBX will be accepted. So these two, if you're if you're getting phantom or ghost calls, make sure you disable these two options or set them to yes, I mean. Next is a privacy header. This is how you push or you send your caller ID. That depends whether your carrier or your IP PBX supports them. You can use only one of them, either the privacy header or the PPI header. The DTMF, when you use the gateway, for example, with a carrier or use it in a different scenario, always make sure that the gateway is configured with the proper DTMF. By default, 3 of them are used. That means when it does the SIP negotiation, it's going to accept the 3 of them. The 3 DTMF methods that are supported is the RFC, the SIP info, or the in audio or the in band. Then you have that option, disable DTMF negotiation. I recommend just leave it to no. Unless it's giving you problems, then you can set it to yes. DTMF negotiation, as I mentioned, when there is a SIP message, the gateway will negotiate for the 3 DTMF methods. If you want to use all the time, if you have strict rules and you have your own policy and you want to use only RFC 2833, that's when you can come here and check that one to yes. That means the gateway will only accept the prior the RFC 2833. We talked about these options like DND, call forwarding. Sometimes you would like to use the call forwarding or DND of your SIP server or your IP PBX. If that is the case, you can actually just disable these call features. That means when you dial *72, whatever, the gateway is going to send it to your IP PBX. It's not going to treat those call features as local call features. Then you have the off-hook auto dial delay. By default, it's 0, which means if you have auto dial configured, so once you take the handset off hook, it's just going to dial whatever extension or number that you have configured. And this is something that you do under the FXS port, and we're going to talk about it later. Next, we move on to the call waiting. If you would like to disable call waiting, that means if you only want to receive call, if a second person calls in, you want them to get a busy tone, just set that one to yes. You can disable the call waiting tone in case you have it enabled. And then we have like disable visual MWI. That depends whether your phone supports the MWI. Is the LED that lights up when there is a voicemail. If you would like to disable that option, set it to yes. If you would like to use it, of course, just keep it as default. And for the MWI type, we support 2 types. We support the FSK and then the neon. That depends on which one your phone is using. And by default, the ring timeout on the gateway is 60 seconds. That means when someone calls the gateway, it's going to ring for 60 seconds. If nobody picks up, that's when it's going to go to voicemail or just get forwarded to a different number. The gateway also has the option where you can configure the hunt group, and you can do it in two modes. You can do circular or linear. If you use linear, if you use circular, that means if the first call rings port 1, the second one is going to go to port 2, the third one is going to go to port 3. But if you use linear, that means the call will always prioritize FXS port 1 unless FXS port 1 is busy. That's when it's going to go to port 2 or 3. Then you have at the bottom here, you have a dial plan. You can change it. If you go to the user manual and you go to dial plan, these are the characters that are supported in the dial plan. It also gives you the grammar and the syntax, how to use them, and it gives you examples how you can use certain characters for certain examples. Then next we have send anonymous. In case you would like to send the calls anonymous from the gateway, you can just set yes, or you can tell, for example, the gateway whenever there is an anonymous call coming into the gateway, reject the call. Then there is that option for fax. I know that a lot of people, they use this gateway for fax. So I'm just going to summarize the settings that you can use. So when you have this gateway connected to a fax machine, what are the options that you need to configure? The first thing that you need to do when you have a fax machine connected to this gateway, make sure that your fax machine is using a baud rate lower than 1400 or lower. That's number one. The second one, come here to the use first matching decoder in 200 and set that one to yes. And then make sure you are using the PCMU, because the fax always use PCMU. If you choose a different codec, it's not going to work. So check that one, set it to yes, then choose PCMU. And then you have the options somewhere here at the fax mode. The fax mode, if your carrier supports T38, check the T38. If they don't support the T38, you can use the pass-through. And for the T38, if you are using T38, there is the send re-invite right here. Send re-invite after fax. That means when the call hits the gateway and then the gateway detects the fax tone, it's going to send another re-invite to initiate the fax session. So if you are using T38, you need to have that one set to yes. And then the other options, make sure also the echo cancellation is disabled. It is right here, disable line echo canceller, set that one to yes. So these are pretty much the major settings that you need to make when you use the gateway with the fax machine. These are the codecs, and Phil mentioned this already. So we support the major codecs in the VoIP industry, starting from the 64 kilobits per second G711 or the PCMU, all the way to G729. Then here you have the disconnect signaling features. For example, the loop current disconnect, by default is set to no. Sometimes when you are in the middle of the call and the remote party, they hang up the phone, you hear that busy tone like playing on your handset. If you would like to disable that busy tone, just check that one to yes. So when they hang up, you're just going to get a dead air for like 60 seconds. So that gives you time to hang up the handset. So here we configure the SIP server. Next, we need to move on to go to the FXS ports. The FXS port, this is where you configure your analog phones. If you notice, I have FXS1 configured with extension 1016, and then I'm using profile 1. By the way, you can have 2 profiles on the GXW. And then next you have the hunting group. Let's say I have only one account and I have 4 phones and I want to use them as a hunt group, which means anytime someone calls extension 1016, I want it to ring the 4 phones. If you would like to use a hunt group, set the primary ports. It could be FXS 1, 2, 3. You can choose any port that is registered. And then port 2, you tell it to become a member of hunting group on port 1. You can include all these 4 ports in the same hunt group. That means when the call comes in, it's going to ring port 1, then move on to port 2, 3, and so on. Sometimes this one is, we talked about that one. This is how you can configure the request URI. Just include the caller ID in there. Sometimes you have this one. Let me show you. Go back here. You have, for example, 4100, like FXS port paired with the GXW 4000. And on this GXW 4100, you have 4 PSTN lines with 4 numbers, but you only have 1 peer-to-peer connection. If that is the case, you can actually configure those caller IDs for incoming calls on this in this box right here. So if you have it configured this way, that means when a call comes in on a peer-to-peer connection and it's the call is distant for this caller ID, when the call reaches the gateway is going to check against the request URI routing. When it sees that there is this caller ID, it's going to send it automatically to FXS2. If you have ports that are not being used and you don't want to use them, you can just disable the ports by check this one to no. At the bottom here, we have the option for off-hook auto dial. Let's say you have this phone as an emergency. So you want people, whenever they pick up the handset, you want the phone to dial 911. You can configure it this way. So every time anyone picks up the phone that is connected to FXS3, the gateway is going to dial 911. And the next options here, these are for the FXO, what we call the FXO port mapping, for the same scenario that we talked about. In case you have 4 phones and you have 4 PSTN lines and you want each phone to use a specific port on the FXO gateway, you can actually tell it which line to use. For example, the one to use line 2 and line 3, and then include the IP address of the FXO gateway. Let's say it's 87. If it's the same gateway, just keep including the same IP. If you would like to send it on port 2, just change, because each port uses a different, physical port uses a different logical port number, and from one port to the other port, the number always increments by 2. So it's going to be 5060, 5062, and then 5064, and so on. And I think that's pretty much it. So I tried to cover most of the features. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask them. So I'll give it to Phil.
Awesome. Thanks, Abdel. Yeah, there's a couple of questions, maybe 5 or 6, that came in during. We'll go through some of those. Let me know if you think you already answered them. Somebody was asking, actually this was Anna was asking earlier on, are you aware of any possible upgrades to the web UI for these products? There's nothing that I'm aware of. Yeah.
I'm not aware of that.
This is a pretty, I know it doesn't, maybe look as pretty as some of the other ones, but this interface we've had going for, for a while. It is very stable. So yeah, it's probably going to stay how it is. Mark was asking if you could explain, and maybe you did, how bandwidth throttling works.
So we're going to have to go back to advanced settings where we have the option, basic settings. So I think you're talking about this feature. So you configure that one. For example, you have a bandwidth and you don't want all the bandwidth to be used by the gateway. You can tell the gateway the max of bandwidth that it can use. If you choose, for example, let's say a call usually like with the PCMU takes around like 80 kilobits per second. If you would like to limit the number of calls, let's say to 3, you can choose 256 kilobits per second. That means only 3 calls can be made out of this gateway. The same thing with the downlink. You can tell it, or tell it, for example, what is the bandwidth that it can use. This is one option. There's the other option that we talked about for the gateway is the DSCP. That's under the profile settings, where you can tell it which DSCP class you would like to assign it. For example, if you assign it 46 and you don't have the bandwidth configured, that means the traffic of this gateway will always be prioritized, and it's going to take whatever bandwidth it needs from your total bandwidth in your network.
Awesome. Mark is asking if you can download CFG remotely to keep emergency backup to provision a new one. That makes sense.
Yeah, you can actually do that. Yeah, absolutely. Just when you go to advanced settings, let's say you have this gateway, it's working fine, the configuration is perfect, and you want to keep it so in case this one goes down, you want to upload it to a different one. You can do that. Download the device configuration XML file. And when you do that, point it to or place this backup in whatever. If you're using TFTP or HTTP server, put it somewhere. And then if you want to provision a new device, then you just have to go to the config server path this way and then point it to whatever you're using, if you're using HTTP or TFTP. The way it works with the GXW, every time they reboot and they're looking for the config file, they always look for the CFG.xml file, or they look for CFG MAC address .xml file. If you go to the Grandstream website, there is a document that explains the provisioning of Grandstream, and it gives you a lot of information how you can provision those devices. Let me just look for it here quickly. It's right here, GS-SIP device provisioning guide. This guide, if you read it, it's going to answer all your questions how you can upload and download the configuration of your Grandstream devices.
Awesome. All right, any final questions you have, get them in. At the moment, I only have one more question. Doug's asking, can you send the Hunt group to ring all phones at the same time?
No, we don't have that option. At the moment, we only have 2 options, circular or linear. That means only one of them would be able to ring at a time.
Awesome. All right. Mark's asking, and you know, this might be something more specific that we might need to look into. Why does the GXW get so hot? And I guess this probably has more to do with if you have any experience with it.
Just one thing about the GXW, it doesn't have a fan. So if you want to place it somewhere that is very well ventilated. I mean, the processing that it does not require a lot of resources. That's why they did not include the fan in the GXW. That's why it's quiet and it doesn't make any noise. But just make sure, as I said again, put it somewhere that is really well ventilated.
Yeah, I guess especially if it's around a lot of other things that are creating heat. Yeah, which is where these things often are. Awesome. Any final questions? Last call for questions. All right, so that looks like it's it. If anyone does come up with anything, feel free to type it over, and we'll hang around for a moment or two and answer any final questions that come in. But for everybody else, I want to thank you for being with us here today. Did record this webinar. It will be available either today or tomorrow on our YouTube page. You can go to youtube.com/GrandstreamNetworks, spelled out, youtube.com/GrandstreamNetworks, which is where the recording of this will be, full audio and video. Also have a couple of other recent webinar recordings as well up there, so check that out. We have a variety of other training webinars coming up in the next couple of weeks before the end of June. You can go to grandstream.com and check out our solution. I believe it's grandstream.com/training center, which is where you're going to be able to find all of the upcoming training webinars. We have some coming up for the UCM, IPPBX, our GWN series of access point and routers, and I believe there's one other topic. GDS 3710, our video door system, we're doing a training webinar for, I believe, the last week of July. So grandstream.com/training center for that. And with that, looks like we're wrapping up today's webinar. Again, thanks everyone for being with us here today. Hope this was a worthwhile webinar for you and you got a lot out of it. As I mentioned, Training Center, or grandstream.com/training center for all upcoming training webinars, which we hope to see you at. Hope everyone has a great day, and we hope to see you again in the near future. Take care.